couplets and being so dead keen on reason. So I'd skipped it. They let you do that in honors, you were much freer. I had been so free I'd spent most of my time on Dylan Thomas. A friend of mine, also in honors, had managed never to read a word of Shakespeare, but she was a real expert on the four quartets. I saw how impossible and embarrassing it would be for me to try to switch from my free program into the stricter one. So I looked up the requirements for English majors at the city college where my mother taught. They were even worse. You had to know Old English and the history of the English language and a representative selection of all that had been written from Beowulf to the present day. This surprised me. I had always looked down on my mother's college, as it was co-ed, and filled with people who couldn't get scholarships to the big Eastern colleges. Now I saw that the stupidest person at my mother's college knew more than I did. I saw they wouldn't even let me in through the door, let alone give me a large scholarship like the one I had at my own college. I thought I'd better go to work for a year and think things over. Maybe I could study the 18th century in secret. But I didn't know shorthand, so what could I do? I could be a waitress or a typist. But I couldn't stand the idea of being either one. You say you want more sleeping pills? Yes. But the ones I gave you last week are very strong. They don't work anymore. Teresa's large, dark eyes regarded me thoughtfully. I could hear the voices of her 3 children in the garden under the consulting room window. My Aunt Libby had married an Italian, and Teresa was my aunt's sister-in-law and our family doctor. I liked Teresa. She had a gentle, intuitive touch. I thought it must be because she was Italian. There was a little pause. What seems to be the matter? Teresa said then. I can't sleep. I can't read. I tried to speak in a cool, calm way. But the zombie rose up in my throat and choked me off. I turned my hands palm up. I think. Teresa tore off a white slip from her prescription pad and wrote down a name and address. You'd better see another doctor I know. He'll be able to help you more than I can. I peered at the writing, but I couldn't read it. Dr. Gordon, Teresa said. He's a psychiatrist. 11. Dr. Gordon's waiting room was hushed in beige. The walls were beige, and the carpets were beige, and the upholstered chairs and sofas were beige. There were no mirrors or pictures, only certificates from different medical schools, with Dr. Gordon's name in Latin, hung about the walls. Pale green loopy ferns and spiked leaves of a much darker green filled the ceramic pots on the end table and the coffee table and the magazine table. At first I wondered why the room felt so safe. Then I realized it was because there were no windows. The air conditioning made me shiver. I was still wearing Betsy's white blouse and dirndl skirt. They drooped a bit now, as I hadn't washed them in my 3 weeks at home. The sweaty cotton gave off a sour but friendly smell. I hadn't washed my hair for 3 weeks either. I hadn't slept for 7 nights. My mother told me I must have slept, it was impossible not to sleep. In all that time, but if I slept, it was with my eyes wide open, for I had followed the green, luminous course of the second hand and the minute hand and the hour hand of the bedside clock through their circles and semicircles, every night for 7 nights, without missing a second, or a minute, or an hour. The reason I hadn't washed my clothes or my hair was because it seemed so silly. I saw the days of the year stretching ahead like a series of bright, white boxes, and separating one box from another was sleep, like a black shade. Only for me, the long perspective of shades that set off one box from the next had suddenly snapped up, and I could see day after day after day glaring ahead of me like a white, broad, infinitely desolate avenue. It seemed silly to wash one day when I would only have to wash again the next. It made me tired just to think of it. I wanted to do everything once and for all and be through with it. Dr. Gordon twiddled a silver pencil. Your mother tells me you are upset. I curled in the cavernous leather chair and faced Dr. Gordon across. An acre of highly polished desk. Dr. Gordon waited. He tapped his pencil tap, tap, tap across the neat green field of his blotter. His eyelashes were so long and thick they looked artificial. Black. Plastic reeds fringing two green, glacial pools. Dr. Gordon's features were so perfect he was almost pretty. I hated him the minute I walked in through the door. I had imagined a kind, ugly, intuitive man looking up and saying ah, in an encouraging way, as if he could see something I couldn't, and then I would find words to tell him how I was so scared, as if I were being stuffed farther and farther into a black, airless sack with no way out. Then he would lean back in his chair and match the tips of his fingers together in a little steeple and tell me why I couldn't sleep and why I couldn't read and why I couldn't eat and why everything people did seemed so silly, because they only died in the end. And then, I thought, he would help me, step by step, to be myself again. But Dr. Gordon wasn't like that at all. He was young and good-looking. And I could see right away he was conceited. Dr. Gordon had a photograph on his desk, in a silver frame, that half faced him and half faced my leather chair. It was a family photograph, and it showed a beautiful dark-haired woman, who could have been Dr. Gordon's sister, smiling out over the heads of two blonde children. I think one child was a boy and one was a girl, but it may have been that both children were boys or that both were girls. It is hard to tell when children are so small. I think there was also a dog in the picture, toward the bottom a kind of Airedale or a golden retriever, but it may have only been the pattern in the woman's skirt. For some reason the photograph made me furious. I didn't see why it should be turned half toward me unless Dr. Gordon was trying to show me right away that he was married to some glamorous woman and I'd better not get any funny ideas. Then I thought, how could this Dr. Gordon help me anyway, with a beautiful wife and beautiful children and a beautiful dog haloing him like the angels on a Christmas card? Suppose you try and tell me what you think is wrong. I turned the words over suspiciously, like round, sea-polished pebbles. That might suddenly put out a claw and change into something else. What did I think was wrong? That made it sound as if nothing was really wrong, I only thought it was wrong. In a dull, flat voice to show I was not beguiled by his good looks. Or his family photograph, I told Dr. Gordon about not sleeping and not eating and not reading. I didn't tell him about the handwriting, which bothered me most of all. That morning I had tried to write a letter to Doreen, down in West Virginia, asking whether I could come and live with her and maybe get a job at her college waiting on table or something. But when I took up my pen, my hand made big, jerky letters like those of a child, and the lines sloped down the page from left to right almost diagonally, as if they were loops of string lying on the paper, and someone had come along and blown them askew. I knew I couldn't send a letter like that, so I tore it up in little pieces and put them in my pocketbook, next to my all-purpose compact, in case the psychiatrist asked to see them. But of course Dr. Gordon didn't ask to see them, as I hadn't mentioned them, and I began to feel pleased at my cleverness. I thought I only need tell him what I wanted to, and that I could control the picture he had of me by hiding this and revealing that, all the while he thought he was so smart. The whole time I was talking, Dr. Gordon bent his head as if he were praying, and the only noise apart from the dull, flat voice was the tap, tap, tap of Dr. Gordon's pencil at the same point on the green blotter, like a stalled walking stick. When I had finished, Dr. Gordon lifted his head. "Where did you say you went to college?" Baffled, I told him. I didn't see where college fitted in. Ah. Dr. Gordon leaned back in his chair, staring into the air over my shoulder with a reminiscent smile. I thought he was going to tell me his diagnosis, and that perhaps I had judged him too hastily and too unkindly. But he only said, "I remember your college well. I was up there, during the war. They had a WAC station, didn't they? Or was it waves?" I said I didn't know. "Yes, a WAC station, I remember now. I was doctor for the lot, before I was sent overseas. My, they were a pretty bunch of girls." Dr. Gordon laughed. Then, In one smooth move, he rose to his feet and strolled toward me round the corner of his desk. I wasn't sure what he meant to do, so I stood up as well. Dr. Gordon reached for the hand that hung at my right side and shook it. "See you next week, then." The full, bosomy elms made a tunnel of shade over the yellow and red brick fronts along Commonwealth Avenue, and a trolley car was threading itself toward Boston down its slim, silver track. I waited for the trolley to pass, then crossed to the gray Chevrolet at the opposite curb. I could see my mother's face, anxious and sallow as a slice of lemon, peering up at me through the windshield. "Well, what did he say?" I pulled the car door shut. It didn't catch. I pushed it out and drew it in again with a dull slam. "He said he'll see me next week." My mother sighed. Dr. Gordon cost $25 an hour. "Hi there, what's your name?" "Ellie Higginbottom." The sailor fell into step beside me, and I smiled. I thought there must be as many sailors on the common as there were pigeons. They seemed to come out of a dun-colored recruiting house on the far side, with blue and white "Join the Navy" posters stuck up on billboards round it and all over the inner walls. "Where do you come from, Ellie?" "Chicago." I had never been to Chicago, but I knew one or two boys who went to Chicago University, and it seemed the sort of place where unconventional, mixed-up people would come from. "You sure are a long way from home." The sailor put his arm around my waist, and for a long time we walked around the common like that, the sailor stroking my hip through the green dirndl skirt, and me smiling mysteriously and trying not to say anything that would show I was from Boston and might at any moment meet Mrs. Willard, or one of my mother's other friends, crossing the common after tea on Beacon Hill or shopping in Filling's basement. I thought if I ever did get to Chicago, I might change my name to Ellie Higginbottom for good. Then nobody would know I had thrown up a scholarship at a big Eastern women's college and mucked up a month in New York and refused a perfectly solid medical student for a husband who would one day be a member of the AMA and earn pots of money. In Chicago, people would take me for what I was. I would be simple Ellie Higginbottom, the orphan. People would love me for my sweet, quiet nature. They wouldn't be after me to read books and write long papers on the twins and James Joyce. And one day I might just marry a virile, but tender, garage mechanic and have a big cowy family, like Dodo Conway. If I happen to feel like it. "What do you want to do when you get out of the Navy?" I asked the sailor suddenly. It was the longest sentence I had said, and he seemed taken aback. He pushed his white cupcake cap to one side and scratched his head. "Well, I dunno, Ellie," he said. "I might just go to college on the GI Bill." I paused. Then I said suggestively, "You ever thought of opening a garage?" "Nope," said the sailor. "Never have." I peered at him from the corner of my eye. He didn't look a day over 16. "Do you know how old I am?" I said accusingly. The sailor grinned at me. "Nope, and I don't care either." It occurred to me that this sailor was really remarkably handsome. He looked Nordic and virginal. Now I was simple-minded. It seemed I attracted clean, handsome people. "Well, I'm 30, I said, and waited. "Gee, Ellie, you don't look it." The sailor squeezed my hip. Then he glanced quickly from left to right. "Listen, Ellie, if we go round to those steps over there, under the monument, I can kiss you." At that moment I noticed a brown figure in sensible flat brown shoes striding across the common in my direction. From the distance, I couldn't make out any features on the dime-sized face, but I knew it was Mrs. Willard. "Could you please tell me the way to the subway?" I said to the sailor. In a loud voice. "Huh? The subway that goes out to the Deer Island prison?" When Mrs. Willard came up I would have to pretend I was only asking the sailor directions, and didn't really know him at all. "Take your hands off me," I said between my teeth. "Say, Ellie, what's up?" The woman approached and passed by without a look or a nod, and of course, it wasn't Mrs. Willard. Mrs. Willard was at her cottage in the Adirondacks. I fixed the woman's receding back with a vengeful stare. "Say, Ellie. I thought it was somebody I knew," I said. "Some blasted lady from this orphan home in Chicago." The sailor put his arm around me again. "You mean you got no mom and dad, Ellie?" "No." I let out a tear that seemed ready. It made a little hot track down my cheek. "Say, Ellie, don't cry. This lady, was she mean to you?" She was awful." The tears came in a rush, then, and while the sailor was holding me and patting them dry with a big, clean, white linen handkerchief in the shelter of an American elm, I thought what an awful woman that lady in the brown suit had been, and how she, whether she knew it or not, was responsible for my taking the wrong turn here and the wrong path there and for everything bad that happened after that. "Well, Esther, how do you feel this week?" Dr. Gordon cradled his pencil like a slim, silver bullet. "The same." "The same?" He quirked an eyebrow, as if he didn't believe it. So I told him again, in the same dull, flat voice, only it was angrier. This time, because he seemed so slow to understand, how I hadn't slept for 14 nights and how I couldn't read or write or swallow very well. Dr. Gordon seemed unimpressed. I dug into my pocketbook and found the scraps of my letter to Doreen. I took them out and let them flutter onto Dr. Gordon's immaculate green blotter. They lay there, dumb as daisy petals in a summer meadow. "What," I said, "do you think of that?" I thought Dr. Gordon must immediately see how bad the handwriting was, but he only said, "I think I would like to speak to your mother. Do you mind?" "No." But I didn't like the idea of Dr. Gordon talking to my mother one bit. I thought he might tell her I should be locked up. I picked up every scrap of my letter to Doreen, so Dr. Gordon couldn't piece them together and see I was planning to run away, and walked out of his office without another word. I watched my mother grow smaller and smaller until she disappeared into the door of Dr. Gordon's office building. Then I watched her grow larger and larger as she came back to the car. Well? I could tell she had been crying. My mother didn't look at me. She started the car. Then she said, as we glided under the cool, deep-sea shade of the elms, "Dr. Gordon doesn't think you've improved at all. He thinks you should have some shock treatments at his private hospital in Walton." I felt a sharp stab of curiosity, as if I had just read a terrible newspaper headline about somebody else. "Does he mean live there?" "No," my mother said, and her chin quivered. I thought she must be lying. "You tell me the truth," I said, "or I'll never speak to you again." "Don't I always tell you the truth?" my mother said, and burst into tears. Suicide saved from 7-story ledge. After 2 hours on a narrow ledge 7 stories above a concrete parking lot and gathered crowds, Mr. George Palucci let himself be helped to safety through a nearby window by Sergeant Will Kilmartin of the Charles Street Police Force. I cracked open a peanut from the 10-cent bag I had bought to feed the pigeons, and ate it. It tasted dead, like a bit of old tree bark. I brought the newspaper close up to my eyes to get a better view of George Palucci's face, spotlighted like a 3/4 moon against a vague background of brick and black sky. I felt he had something important to tell me, and whatever it was might just be written on his face. But the smudgy crags of George Palucci's features melted away as I peered at them, and resolved themselves into a regular pattern of dark and light and medium gray dots. The inky black newspaper paragraph didn't tell why Mr. Palucci was on the ledge, or what Sergeant Kilmartin did to him when he finally got him in through the window. The trouble about jumping was that if you didn't pick the right number of stories, you might still be alive when you hit bottom. I thought 7 stories must be a safe distance. I folded the paper and wedged it between the slats of the park bench. It was what my mother called a scandal sheet, full of the local murders and suicides and beatings and robbings, and just about every page had a half-naked lady on it with her breasts surging over the edge of her dress and her legs arranged so you could see to her stocking tops. I didn't know why I had never bought any of these papers before. They were the only things I could read. The little paragraphs between the pictures ended before the letters had a chance to get cocky and wiggle about. At home, all I ever saw was the Christian Science Monitor, which appeared on the doorstep at 5 o'clock every day but Sunday and treated suicides and sex crimes and airplane crashes as if they didn't happen. A big white swan full of little children approached my bench, then turned around a bosky islet covered with ducks and paddled back under the dark arch of the bridge. Everything I looked at seemed bright and extremely tiny. I saw, as if through the keyhole of a door I couldn't open, myself and my younger brother, knee-high and holding rabbit-eared balloons, climb aboard a swan boat and fight for a seat at the edge, over the peanut shell-paved water. My mouth tasted of cleanness and peppermint. If we were good at the dentist's, my mother always bought us a swan boat ride. I circled the public garden over the bridge and under the blue-green monuments, past the American flag flower bed and the entrance where you could have your picture taken in an orange and white striped canvas booth for 25 cents reading the names of the trees. My favorite tree was the weeping scholar tree. I thought it must come from Japan. They understood things of the spirit in Japan. They disemboweled themselves when anything went wrong. I tried to imagine how they would go about it. They must have an extremely sharp knife. No, probably 2 extremely sharp knives. Then they would sit down, cross-legged, a knife in either hand. Then they would cross their hands and point a knife at each side of their stomach. They would have to be naked, or the knife would get stuck in their clothes. Then in one quick flash, before they had time to think twice, they would jab the knives in and zip them round, one on the upper crescent and one on the lower crescent, making a full circle. Then their stomach skin would come loose, like a plate, and their insides would fall out, and they would die. It must take a lot of courage to die like that. My trouble was I hated the sight of blood. I thought I might stay in the park all night. The next morning Dodo Conway was driving my mother and me to Walton. And if I was to run away before it was too late, now was the time. I looked in my pocketbook and counted out $1 bill and 79 cents in dunes and nickels and pennies. I had no idea how much it would cost to get to Chicago, and I didn't dare go to the bank and draw out all my money, because I thought Dr. Gordon might well have warned the bank clerk to intercept me if I made an obvious move. Hitchhiking occurred to me, but I had no idea which of all the routes out of Boston led to Chicago. It's easy enough to find directions on a map, but I had very little knowledge of directions when I was smack in the middle of somewhere. Every time I wanted to figure what was east or what was west it seemed to be noon, or cloudy, which was no help at all, or nighttime, and except for the Big Dipper in Cassiopeia's chair, I was hopeless at stars, a failing which always disheartened Buddy Willard. I decided to walk to the bus terminal and inquire about the fares to Chicago. Then I might go to the bank and withdraw precisely that amount, which would not cause so much suspicion. I had just strolled in through the glass doors of the terminal and was browsing over the rack of colored tour leaflets and schedules, when I realized that the bank in my hometown would be closed, as it was already mid-afternoon, and I couldn't get any money out till the next day. My appointment at Walton was for 10 o'clock. At that moment, the loudspeaker crackled into life and started announcing the stops of a bus getting ready to leave in the parking lot outside. The voice on the loudspeaker went bockle bockle bockle, the way they do, so you can't understand a word, and then, in the middle of all the static, I heard a familiar name clear as A on the piano in the middle of all the tuning instruments of an orchestra. It was a stop 2 blocks from my house. I hurried out into the hot, dusty, end of July afternoon, sweating and sandy-mouthed, as if late for a difficult interview, and boarded the red bus, whose motor was already running. I handed my fare to the driver, and silently, on gloved hinges, the door folded shut at my back. 12. Dr. Gordon's private hospital crowned a grassy rise at the end of a long, secluded drive that had been whitened with broken quahog shells. The yellow clapboard walls of the large house, with its encircling veranda, gleamed in the sun, but no people strolled on the green dome of the lawn. As my mother and I approached, the summer heat bore down on us, and a cicada started up, like an aerial lawnmower, in the heart of a copper beech tree at the back. The sound of the cicada only served to underline the enormous silence. A nurse met us at the door. "Will you wait in the living room, please? Dr. Gordon will be with you presently." What bothered me was that everything about the house seemed normal, although I knew it must be chock full of crazy people. There were no bars on the windows that I could see, and no wild or disquieting noises. Sunlight measured itself out in regular oblongs on the shabby, but soft red carpets, and a whiff of fresh-cut grass sweetened the air. I paused in the doorway of the living room. For a minute I thought it was the replica of a lounge in a guest house I visited once on an island off the coast of Maine. The French doors let in a dazzle of white light, a grand piano filled the far corner of the room, and people in summer clothes were sitting about at card tables and in the lopsided wicker armchairs one so often finds at down-at-heel seaside resorts. Then I realized that none of the people were moving. I focused more closely, trying to pry some clue from their stiff postures. I made out men and women, and boys and girls who must be as young as I, but there was a uniformity to their faces, as if they had lain for a long time on the shelf, out of the sunlight, under siftings of pale, fine dust. Then I saw that some of the people were indeed moving, but with such small, bird-like gestures I had not at first discerned them. A gray-faced man was counting out a deck of cards, 1, 2, 3, 4. I thought he must be seeing if it was a full pack, but when he had finished counting, he started over again. Next to him, a fat lady played with a string of wooden beads. She drew all the beads up to one end of the string. Then click, 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 she let them fall back on each other. At the piano, a young girl leafed through a few sheets of music, but when she saw me looking at her, she ducked her head crossly and tore the sheets in half. My mother touched my arm, and I followed her into the room. We sat, without speaking, on a lumpy sofa that creaked each time one stirred. Then my gaze slid over the people to the blaze of green beyond the diaphanous curtains, and I felt as if I were sitting in the window of an enormous department store. The figures around me weren't people, but shop dummies, painted to resemble people and propped up in attitudes counterfeiting life. I climbed after Dr. Gordon's dark-jacketed back. Downstairs, in the hall, I had tried to ask him what the shock treatment would be like, but when I opened my mouth no words came out, my eyes only widened and stared at the smiling, familiar face that floated before me like a plate full of assurances. At the top of the stairs, the garnet-colored carpet stopped. A plain, brown linoleum, tacked to the floor, took its place, and extended down a corridor lined with shut white doors. As I followed Dr. Gordon, a door opened somewhere in the distance, and I heard a woman shouting. All at once a nurse popped around the corner of the corridor ahead of us leading a woman in a blue bathrobe with shaggy, waist-length hair. Dr. Gordon stepped back, and I flattened against the wall. As the woman was dragged by, waving her arms and struggling in the grip of the nurse, she was saying, "I'm going to jump out of the window, I'm going to jump out of the window, I'm going to jump out of the window." Dumpy and muscular in her smudge-fronted uniform, the wall-eyed nurse wore such thick spectacles that 4 eyes peered out at me from behind the round, twin panes of glass. I was trying to tell which eyes were the real eyes and which the false eyes, and which of the real eyes was the wall eye and which the straight eye, when she brought her face up to mine with a large, conspiratorial grin and hissed, as if to reassure me, "She thinks she's going to jump out the window, but she can't jump out the window because they're all barred." And as Dr. Gordon led me into a bare room at the back of the house, I saw that the windows in that part were indeed barred, and that the room door and the closet door and the drawers of the bureau and everything that opened and shut was fitted with a keyhole so it could be locked up. I lay down on the bed. The wall-eyed nurse came back. She unclasped my watch and dropped it in her pocket. Then she started tweaking the hairpins from my hair. Dr. Gordon was unlocking the closet. He dragged out a table on wheels with a machine on it and rolled it behind the head of the bed. the nurse started swabbing my temples with a smelly grease. As she leaned over to reach the side of my head nearest the wall, her fat breast muffled my face like a cloud or a pillow. A vague, medicinal stench emanated from her flesh. "Don't worry," the nurse grinned down at me. "Their first time. Everybody's scared to death." I tried to smile, but my skin had gone stiff, like parchment. Dr. Gordon was fitting 2 metal plates on either side of my head. He buckled them into place with a strap that dented my forehead, and gave me a wire to bite. I shut my eyes. There was a brief silence, like an indrawn breath. Then something bent down and took hold of me and shook me like the end of the world. "Wee!" it shrilled, through an air crackling with blue light, and with each flash a great jolt drugged me till I thought my bones would break and the sap fly out of me like a split plant. I wondered what terrible thing it was that I had done. I was sitting in a wicker chair, holding a small cocktail glass of tomato juice. The watch had been replaced on my wrist, but it looked odd. Then I realized it had been fastened upside down. I sensed the unfamiliar positioning of the hairpins in my hair. "How do you feel?" An old metal floor lamp surfaced in my mind. One of the few relics of my father's study, it was surmounted by a copper bell which held the light bulb, and from which a frayed, tiger-colored cord ran down the length of the metal stand to a socket in the wall. One day I decided to move this lamp from the side of my mother's bed to my desk at the other end of the room. The cord would be long enough, so I didn't unplug it. I closed both hands around the lamp and the fuzzy cord and gripped them tight. Then something leapt out of the lamp in a blue flash and shook me till my teeth rattled, and I tried to pull my hands off, but they were stuck, and I screamed, or a scream was torn from my throat, for I didn't recognize it, but heard it soar and quaver in the air like a violently disembodied spirit. Then my hands jerked free, and I fell back onto my mother's bed. A small hole, blackened as if with pencil lead, pitted the center of my right palm. "How do you feel?" "All right." But I didn't. I felt terrible. "Which college did you say you went to?" I said what college it was. "Ah." Dr. Gordon's face lighted with a slow, almost tropical smile. "They had a WAC station up there, didn't they, during the war?" My mother's knuckles were bone-white, as if the skin had worn off them in the hour of waiting. She looked past me to Dr. Gordon, and he must have nodded, or smiled, because her face relaxed. "A few more shock treatments, Mrs. Greenwood," I heard Dr. Gordon say, "and I think you'll notice a wonderful improvement." The girl was still sitting on the piano stool, the torn sheet of music splayed at her feet like a dead bird. She stared at me, and I stared back. Her eyes narrowed. She stuck out her tongue. My mother was following Dr. Gordon to the door. I lingered behind, and when their backs were turned, I rounded on the girl and thumbed both ears at her. She pulled her tongue in, and her face went stony. I walked out into the sun. Panther-like in a dapple of tree shadow, Dodo Conway's black station wagon lay in wait. The station wagon had been ordered originally by a wealthy society lady. Black, without a speck of chrome, and with black leather upholstery, but when it came, it depressed her. It was the dead spit of a hearse, she said, and everybody else thought so too, and nobody would buy it, so the Conways drove it home, cut price, and saved themselves a couple of $100. Sitting in the front seat, between Dodo and my mother, I felt dumb and subdued. Every time I tried to concentrate, my mind glided off, like a skater, into a large empty space, and pirouetted there, absently. "I'm through with that Dr. Gordon," I said, after we had left Dodo in her black station wagon behind the pines. "You can call him up and tell him I'm not coming next week." My mother smiled. I knew my baby wasn't like that. I looked at her. "Like what?" "Like those awful people. Those awful dead people at that hospital." She paused. "I knew you'd decide to be all right again. Starlet succumbs after 68-hour coma." I felt in my pocketbook among the paper scraps and the compact and the peanut shells and the dimes and nickels and the blue Jiffy box containing 19 Gillette blades, till I unearthed the snapshot I'd had taken that afternoon in the orange and white striped booth. I brought it up next to the smudgy photograph of the dead girl. It matched, mouth for mouth, nose for nose. The only difference was the eyes. The eyes in the snapshot were open, and those in the newspaper photograph were closed. But I knew if the dead girl's eyes were to be thumbed wide, they would look at me with the same dead, black, vacant expression as the eyes in the snapshot. I stuffed the snapshot back in my pocketbook. I will just sit here in the sun on this park bench 5 minutes more by the clock on that building over there, I told myself, and then I will go somewhere and do it. I summoned my little chorus of voices. Doesn't your work interest you, Esther? You know, Esther, you've got the perfect setup of a true neurotic. You'll never get anywhere like that, you'll never get anywhere like that, you'll never get anywhere like that. Once on a hot summer night, I had spent an hour kissing a hairy, ape-shaped law student from Yale because I felt sorry for him, he was so ugly. When I had finished, he said, "I have you typed, baby. You'll be a prude at 40. Factitious, my creative writing professor at college scrawled on a story of mine called The Big Weekend. I hadn't known what factitious meant, so I looked it up in the dictionary. Factitious, artificial, sham. You'll never get anywhere like that. I hadn't slept for 21 nights. I thought the most beautiful thing in the world must be shadow, the million moving shapes and cul-de-sacs of shadow. There was shadow in bureau drawers and closets and suitcases, and shadow under houses and trees and stones, and shadow at the back of people's eyes and smiles, and shadow, miles and miles and miles of it, on the night side of the earth. I looked down at the 2 flesh-colored band-aids forming a cross on the calf of my right leg. That morning I had made a start. I had locked myself in the bathroom, and run a tub full of warm water, and taken out a Gillette blade. When they asked some old Roman philosopher or other how he wanted to die, he said he would open his veins in a warm bath. I thought it would be easy, lying in the tub and seeing the redness flower from my wrists, flush after flush through the clear water, till I sank to sleep under a surf gaudy as poppies. But when it came right down to it, the skin of my wrist looked so white and defenseless that I couldn't do it. It was as if what I wanted to kill wasn't in that skin or the thin blue pulse that jumped under my thumb, but somewhere else, deeper, more secret, a whole lot harder to get at. It would take 2 motions. One wrist, then the other wrist. 3 motions, if you counted changing the razor from hand to hand. Then I would step into the tub and lie down. I moved in front of the medicine cabinet. If I looked in the mirror while I did it, it would be like watching somebody else, in a book or a play. But the person in the mirror was paralyzed and too stupid to do a thing. Then I thought maybe I ought to spill a little blood for practice, so I sat on the edge of the tub and crossed my right ankle over my left knee. Then I lifted my right hand with the razor and let it drop of its own weight, like a guillotine, onto the calf of my leg. I felt nothing. Then I felt a small, deep thrill, and a bright seam of red welled up at the lip of the slash. The blood gathered darkly, like fruit, and rolled down my ankle into the cup of my black patent leather shoe. I thought of getting into the tub then, but I realized my dallying had used up the better part of the morning, and that my mother would probably come home and find me before I was done. So I bandaged the cut, packed up my Gillette blades and caught the 11:30 bus to Boston. Sorry, baby, there's no subway to the Deer Island prison, it's on an island. No, it's not on an island, it used to be on an island, but they filled up the water with dirt and now it joins on to the mainland. There's no subway. I've got to get there. Hey, the fat man in the ticket booth peered at me through the grating. Don't cry. Who you got there, honey? Some relative. People shoved and bumped by me in the artificially lit dark, hurrying after the trains that rumbled in and out of the intestinal tunnels under Scala Square. I could feel the tears start to spurt from the screwed-up nozzles of my eyes. It's my father. The fat man consulted a diagram on the wall of his booth. Here's how you do, he said. You take a car from that track over there and get off at Orion Heights and then hop a bus with the point on it. He beamed at me. It'll run you straight to the prison gate. Hey you. A young fellow in a blue uniform waved from the hut. I waved back and kept on going. Hey you. I stopped and walked slowly over to the hut that perched like a circular living room on the waste of sands. Hey, you can't go any further. That's prison property, no trespassers allowed. I thought you could go any place along the beach, I said. So long as you stayed under the tittle line. The fellow thought a minute. Then he said, not this beach. He had a pleasant, fresh face. You've a nice place here, I said. It's like a little house. He glanced back into the room, with its braided rug and chintz curtains. He smiled.